السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجه. ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. السلام عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك. عليكم مني جميعا سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين عليهم السلام. السلام عليك يا أبا صالح المهدي عجل الله تعالى فرجه الشريف. Inshallah, tonight, on this third night of our discussions relating to Arba'een and our reflections on the ziyarah that we performed of the Holy Imam on the day of Arba'een. Today I think I'd like to just conclude by opening up a little bit, expanding on the discussion of brotherhood and friendship in Islam. We kind of touched on it last night a bit, but I think it would be perhaps in our best interest from the discussions that we had thus far, something very tangible that we can summarize as far as our responsibilities towards each other, our responsibilities towards the Imam, and trying to understand what it really means to experience the journey that the caravan of the Imam did from the beginning of the journey to the end, and how we are engaging with that caravan, not only in that journey, in that time, but in its meaning, and how a caravan like that is present today, and it's moving as well from station to station. And of course, the leader of that caravan is none other but the Holy Imam of our time. So what's important here is to try and understand the inner dynamic of how the people of these caravan interact with one another, and what allows them to have such a strong bond that once a person enters this, that means once there's been an imami or almost like a prophetic like invitation to come, once that comes and a person accepts that, it's almost impossible for a person to allow themselves to leave. So what's most important is for a person to gain entry. And we spoke about the idea of taking advantages of the opportunities that are presented to us, that the Holy Quran also speaks about this as well. That respond positively, استجيبوا لله وللرسول إذا دعاكم لما يحييكم. When they call to something that is in your best interest, that gives real life, real purpose, real meaning to your lives, respond positively to that. Okay, so the Holy Quran of course establishes this main principle of إنما المؤمنون إخوة, and hence it falls فأصلحوا بين أخويكم, that indeed the brothers, the believers are brothers, truly brothers. And at the same time we spoke about this, the verse of الأخلاء يومئذ بعضهم لبعض عدو إلا المتقين, that on the day of judgment the brothers or any friendship that has been established will turn into an enmity and an escape from one another, with exception to the muttaqin. So, in saying that, the question I want to pose now, and will be the start of our talk, is that why is there such an insistence in the Quran and in Islamic teaching that brotherhood be exclusive to only the believers? Now, the Quran could have said that the believing men and women can be brothers and sisters of one another, and it didn't need to make exclusive the relationship that people have with one another in the idea of belief or faith. Could have said this is a brotherhood, this is a bond, and there are other bonds as well. And it could have said this is a better bond. But it speaks about exclusivity here, that this can only and truly be the bond. So the question of reflection is here, the interactions that we have with people, the friendships, or even if we don't call them friendships, but in any case the time that we spend with people in our lives, how does that contrast to an Islamic model of friendship? And why do I choose to spend time with certain people? And why do I find myself challenged with time when it comes to spending time with those people that I think perhaps will be best suited? Now, this is not a point that is specific to any age. So every age group will have to answer this question based on the reflections of what is going on in their life. So if you're younger, then of course most of your friends will be people that either you go to school with, or you play with, or you have some sort of family relationships with your cousins and things like that. If you're a little older, then perhaps if you're in university, your classmates, If you're working, you're a professional, then your colleagues, your coworkers, we spend a lot of our days with these people. Okay, well obviously we may not be friends with many of them, but why is there an insistence on the Quran to make your friendships and brotherhoods only with these believing men and women? My thought here, and I think it's one that we can all discuss, and it's something that's good for us to reflect on. Islam asks the question of what will be the extent of the relationship that you have with a person. Any activity a person does that they engage with another, that activity that they're doing will define the parameters of their friendship and of their interaction. So let's say we're all sitting here right now, and we're attending and we're interacting with a majlis. So our communication, our relationship is defined by the parameters of this majlis. Okay. So once the majlis is done, there will be no reason for us to be together because the majlis is not happening, hence we go our separate ways. Each activity that we have, that activity defines why we engage with other people. Islam says that there has to be something more that keeps you together after all of these activities are done. And Islam sees the time that you spend with any person to be an investment. And hence, because it's defined as being an investment, it asks you to think, what will be the extent of the interaction and relationship that you can have with the person right now that you're engaging with? Now you say, well, in the majlis right now, I will engage insofar as we are attendees in the majlis. If that's the limit to the engagement that you have with this person, then it's a very short-lived one. When we speak of the responsibilities that a believer has upon another believer, and that's one of the topics that we're going to go over tonight, it speaks of a lot more than just having a casual, sort of very respectable interaction with other people. It brings a burden almost upon the shoulders of an individual. So if we were to say, any person who is sitting in the majlis right now, the etiquette of the majlis is that if anyone asks you for any amount of money, you have to give it to them. That may seem a tall order, because it seems uncharacteristic of just because a person comes to the majlis, for example, then I have to give him any money he asks me for. No, if they're my family member and they ask for money, sure, I'll probably consider it a lot more than if some stranger comes to the masjid and they just say, give me money. Okay, so that's one reflection point to keep in mind. When we interact with other people in any context, how can we define the extent of our relationship? And can we call to those people in times of need? Okay, so what I'd like to do tonight is to share 3 main points. Number one is that what are the rights of a Muslim against another Muslim, or a believer, a mu'min against another believer? So we have a lot of hadith that speaks about this. So I'm going to survey just one of them. And in that, the Imam presents 7 different rights that a Muslim brother has upon his Muslim brother. So that's the first point. To try and survey what those rights are, that'll help us better answer this question. The second idea that we want to explore is that what are the individual characteristics of a good believing brother or a good believing friend as defined in hadith. And we'll read from a hadith found in Nahj al-Balagha from Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salatu wasalam. And number 3 is that what are those types of people that we can characterize as being bad friends, or people that are not worth our investment or friendship, and we should try and stay away from them. So we're going to inshallah explore these 3 topics, and inshallah we'll conclude with the original points we were making, not last night but the night before. Okay, the first hadith is found in Al-Kafi, and it's a hadith that is narrated now from Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam, from a companion by the name of Mu'alla ibn Khunais. So Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam, of course, had a lot of companions and a lot of students, and there was reasons for that. The socio-political environment allowed for the Imam to engage in a little bit more freely with the environment, with the nation. And the Imam had a lot of very, very close companions. So Mu'alla ibn Khunais is one of these people. And of the companions of Imam Sadiq, many of us may have heard names or know of these companions. And it's kind of hard to say that, to try and number all of the companions that the Imam had because of the extent of his activities. So some of them that are a little bit more well known, we have Jabir ibn Hayyan, we have Jamil ibn Darraj, we have Abu Basir Layth al-Bakhtari, we have Hisham ibn Hakam, of course one of the younger companions of the Imam, Jabir ibn Yazid al-Ju'fi, And finally, Safwan ibn Mahran, that the ziyarah of Arba'in is instructed to him by the Imam. So there are a lot of other students of the Imam, and many of these are found in the hadith that we have that are narrated from the Imam. Very close people from the Imam generally have been tasked with receiving the hadith and sharing it with, the Shia and the community. In any case, about this Mu'all ibn Khunais al-Bazzaz, sometimes known as his nickname, he was a draper by trade, and he had a very close responsibility and relationship with the Imam in that he had the task of being the Imam's retainer. That means he managed some of the Imam's wealth, specifically related to his family. Anyways, Mu'all ibn Khunais, in the hadith tradition that we have, more than 200 narrations have been narrated from the Imam through him. So this makes him a very important person for us to know. Just to very briefly summarize one of the events of his life, Mu'all ibn Khunais, because he was a close companion of the Imam, and the political rulers knew not only of the teaching of the Imam that was very clear for people to see, but there was an underground network that existed during the time of the Imam Sadiq and other Imams as well, that a lot of things were being done, under the radar, that the political rule then wanted to know exactly what was happening, and specifically because it was a time that there was a shift in political power. So they say that one day this Mu'all ibn Khunais was detained by the police force of the governor of Medina. And in some narrations they say that this was during the time that Imam Sadiq was out of the city. Some say he was in Mecca, perhaps performing Hajj or Umrah. In any case, Mu'all ibn Khunais is brought in and detained. Again, in some narrations they say the reason that they detained him is because they wanted to question him, and the questioning was related to what this underground network was, and what are the names involved, and the people who are engaging in this underground activities. So they detained him to try to get information out of him. Who are your co-hosts? Who are your co-workers? Who else has responsibilities that is getting a lot of is moving a lot of the pieces that the Imam is doing? So Mu'all ibn Khunais, of course, does not give in, and because of that, now this main shorta, as they call them. Shorta is essentially the police force that the governors had. This police chief essentially tells Mu'all ibn Khunais that I'm going to kill you. And this is by order of the governor of the time. His name is, Dawood ibn Ali. Yes, Dawood ibn Ali was the name of the governor of Medina at that time. In any case, so he brings him and tells Mu'all ibn Khunais that I'm going to kill you. Now Mu'all ibn Khunais was a smart companion, and because they were instructed by the Imams to be smart, he said, now that you're going to kill me, I have a request. Because I have debts to pay, grant me the opportunity to come in the middle of the people and tell them, I owe money, this is where my money should be returned to, because it was a very common practice after people died, because there weren't a lot of things written down on paper. It's not like the person's finances were written and recorded. After a person would die, people would come and say, like, he owed me money. And we have this in a lot of the ahkam. If you're, one of the reasons why you're supposed to have a will written is because if you owe money to someone or someone owes you money, it should be written down. So afterwards, either you can go collect the money or people can come collect their money, to stop people from coming just saying, this guy owes me money. And a lot of people did that. In any case, he said, afford me that opportunity. And his police chief said, okay, let's go. So he takes him in the middle of the bazaar. And Mu'all ibn Khunais says that, people, if you don't know who I am, and I'll read a little bit of Arabic. He says that, أنا معل ابن خنيس أيها الناس فمن عرفني فقد عرفني. Whoever knows who I am, they know who I am. فقد عرفني اشهدوا أني ما تركت من مال عين أو دين أو أمة أو عبد أو دار أو قليل أو كثير فهو لجعفر بن محمد عليه الصلاة والسلام. It says, know that anything that is mine, small, big, any sort of money that I'm owed, anything that is in my possession, know that it belongs to Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam. Why was he saying this? Because he was a retainer of the Imam. A lot of the money of the Imam was in the possession of Mu'all ibn Khunais. So what would happen is after he died, people would come and say, this guy owed me this much money. And they would be forced to give it to them. Which one of these things happened after actually the death of Mu'all ibn Khunais? In any case, this police chief got very upset and he was killed, and he was actually, his body was hung in the bazaar of Medina for a short period of time to make a statement essentially to that underground network of the Imam, that we know who you are, we're going to find out who you are, and this is what's going to happen to you. In any case, Mu'all ibn Khunais is now narrating from Imam Sadiq alayhi salatu wasalam found in Al-Kafi, قال قلت له ما حق المسلم على المسلم. I asked him, what is the right of a Muslim upon another Muslim? The Imam responded like this: قال له سبع حقوق واجبات ما منهن حق إلا وهو عليه واجب. Says that there is 7 rights that are obligatory for one Muslim brother to another, and there is no right from these except that it be obligatory upon him. So none of these are recommended to do. A person has to perform these things. If he were to waste any of these, إن ضيع منها شيء خرج من ولاية الله وطاعته. Anyone that wastes any of these 7s would exit outside the wilaya of Allah. We touched on this yesterday and the day before, the idea of wilaya of Allah and wilaya between the believers as well. So this idea of loving for Allah, for the sake of Allah, hating for the sake of Allah, this is to stay within the network of the wilaya of Allah. وَلَمْ يَكُنْ لِلَّهِ فِيهِ مِن نَصِيبٍ. Anyone who disregards any of them, then for him in the presence of Allah there would not be a share. قُلْتُ لَهُ. Mu'all ibn Khunayf says that I said to the Imam, جُعِلْتُ فِدَاكَ وَمَا هِيَ. What are these 7 things? قَالَ يَا مُعَلَّى. This is very profound what the Imam says. Look, the person is a close companion. He's a confidant of the Imam. The Imam trusts his money with him. He trusts the money of his family with him. And the companion is going forth and asking the question. The Imam says there are 7 things. The Imam says, tell me these 7. And the Imam first, before he begins to tell them, in another hadith of Mu'all ibn Khunayf, this comes as well. The Imam stops quickly. Before he says, before I tell you, know that more than I need you to be prepared for me to trust my money and my wealth with you, I need your heart and your mind to be prepared to receive the knowledge, the purified knowledge from me, so that you don't impurify it, you don't taint it, and it's shared correctly with the trust that needs to exist in the knowledge. The money is not important to the Imam. The teachings of the Imam, that they're shared from one generation to another, unadulterated, is what is more important. It says, Ya Mu'alla, inni alayka shafiqun. Mu'alla, no, I love you, I have a great respect for you, I am affectionate towards you. أخاف أن تضيع ولا تحفظ وتعلم ولا تعمل. It says, because I care about you, I'm afraid that I'm going to teach you and you're not going to do justice to it. You're going to learn it, but you're not going to act on it. قال قلت له لا قوة إلا بالله. I responded, there is no power except for Allah. So the takeaway point here is that the Imams, this is constantly repeated after another in the hadith. The Imams were not liberal with sharing knowledge with people. It wasn't that people just wanted to ask the Imams and the Imams were very happy and open about sharing everything with everybody. No. A person has to show a readiness, has to show some sort of capacity to do justice to what is going to be received before the Imams trust that person with that knowledge. Because that's what they're tasked to do. And this is something I think that within our state right now, there could possibly be a reason why we find ourselves stuck. We've plateaued as far as the literacy of the Islamic community is concerned. One of those reasons, among many reasons, is that we attempt to engage with things that we're not ready to engage with yet. And we don't understand, many times because we're just not taught, that there needs to be a humility before a person can even think about receiving this purified knowledge. We say these are moral teachings. Why would anyone be stingy with them? It's not the point. The point is not to just hear the things. The point is once you receive it, you should be so ready to receive it that it immediately turns into action. If it doesn't, you've been burdened by that. In other ahadith, people would come to the Imams and to the Prophet even. They say, teach me these things. Tell me about the things that will happen after death. The Imam says, no, you're not ready, go, don't ask me. They would insist, they're young, no, I want to know, I'm a good person, please teach me. The Imams would refuse. Finally, after a while, the Imam would open one door. The person was not ready. Sometimes even physiologically, it would be too much. It would overwhelm them. Many of them would become old instantaneously. Some of them would die. But more than that, the physiological effects, the Imam says that this brings a responsibility towards you. If I tell you and once you've heard it, that means you have to act on it. And because of the love that the Imam has, he does this. In any case, that's another point of reflection right now. So the Imam says, قَالَ أَيْسَرُ حَقٍ مِّنْهَا, the easiest of these 7 responsibilities that a Muslim brother has to his other brother, أَن تُحِبُّ لَهُ مَا تُحِبُّ لِنَفْسِكَ وَتَكْرَهُ لَهُ مَا تَكْرَهُ لِنَفْسِكَ, to love for your brother what you love for yourself, and for you to dislike for him what you dislike for yourself. So this is the general principle and rule. So the easiest of these 7, and these 7 are among 70 in other hadith that we have, this is the easiest thing. So keep this in your mind. It's very simple. Whatever you want for yourself, want for your brother as well. Number 2, وَالْحَقُّ الثَّانِي أَن تَجْتَنِبَ سَخَطَهُ وَتَتَّبِعْ مَرْضَاتَهُ وَتُطِيعَ أَمْرَهُ. Number 2 is that you keep him away from his anger. It means don't anger him. And follow his pleasure. Do those things that make him happy and obey his instructions. Now, a person may say, well, my believing brother has an anger problem, and anything I tell him is going to make him angry. And if I have to do the things that are pleasing to him, what if they're bad things? And if I'm going to follow his instructions, what if he tells me to do bad things? Of course. What's understood here is not to do whatever they tell you. The point here is that don't do things that will anger another person. If he asks something of you, don't make life difficult for him. What's understood here is if a person is a believer, he should not ask you anyways, another believer, to do something that is outside the laws of Islam. If there are, you advise him, you admonish him. But don't anger him in doing that. وَالْحَقُّ الثَّالِث, number 3, أَن تُعِينَهُ بِنَفْسِكَ وَمَالِكَ وَلِسَانِكَ وَيَدِكَ وَرِجْلِكَ, for you to support him with yourself, بِنَفْسِك, with your everything, and with your wealth, with your tongue, with your hand, with your legs. Anything that you have at your disposal should be at the disposal of your brother. So now imagine how the Imam begins the hadith. He says, I don't want to tell you, because if I tell you these things and you don't do it, then you're burdened by that. Now imagine if the Muslim community was never told these things. That just because a person says the Shahadatain, everything that you have has to be at the disposal of your brother. That's not an easy thing, it's not an easy principle to sell to people. Imagine that. But when has ever the religion been easy? This is not a fraternity, this is not a cult. Something as simple as 2 statements, the Imam is saying that brings, a world of responsibility on your shoulders. So don't take things like this lightly. Number 3, and we'll return to some of these. وَالْحَقُّ الرَّابِعُ أَن تَكُونَ عَيْنَهُ وَدَلِيلَهُ وَمِرْآتَهُ. Number 4 is that you be his eye, you be his guide, you be his mirror. For you to also not to try and involve yourself in a person's life. No, respect the boundaries of a person, but at the same time you should also be cautious and wary of the direction that his life is headed, just like you are for yourself. Be aynahu. Say, this is dangerous for you. Don't do that. Advise him. Advise her. So, in all of these things that are being said, I'm not saying whether these are being done or not being done, but I know the reservations that people have is that, well, it's none of my business. But the religion is exactly saying that it's exactly your business, right? Because the caravan that left from Medina to Karbala, everyone was in everybody's business. It wasn't like one companion decided, today, I don't want to come anymore. I'm just going to leave. No, other people, what are you doing? Do you know what you're doing? Do you know what's going to happen to you? Everyone is encouraging the other. So why is that not happening right now in the Muslim community? So either we haven't heard these things, or if we've heard them, we don't take them seriously, or we don't believe them. It's one of these things. وَالْحَقُّ الْخَامِسِ, the 5th right, أَنْ لَا تَشْبَعْ وَيَجُوعْ وَلَا تَرْوَى وَيَظْمَأُ وَلَا تَلْبَسَ وَيَعْرَى. Number 5 is that for you not to be full and satiated when your brother is hungry, for you not to have quenched your thirst and your brother to be thirsty, for you not to be wearing clothes or the type of clothes that you're wearing for your brother to be bare or naked. That means there should almost be not an absolute equality. We're not saying that there needs to be like absolute socialism where everybody's the same, nobody's different, everybody wears the same clothes, everybody looks the same, everybody has the same name. No. But if there's a gap, if there's an inequality, if there is a classism, that's a problem. Now, this is a hot topic specifically in this country that revolves around a capitalistic model. Capitalistic model says that however hard you work, you're going to be rewarded for that. وَأَنْ لَيْسَ لِلْإِنسَانِ إِلَّا مَا سَعَى. It's a Quranic principle. So if you work hard and you make more, then you should appreciate and you should enjoy what you've been given. Why is it upon you to go and look after the person who has less than you? Because logically what is inferred is that if that person has less than you, that means that they've tried less. They've worked not as hard as you have. Okay? Why do you have to be responsible for that person's inadequacies or their laziness? You shouldn't be responsible for that. But the question I ask is that, what if even within the Muslim community people are lazy? Are we still tasked with putting our finances and our life and our time at their disposal? That's the question I want to ask the people sitting in this majlis right now. Are we still tasked with that? I know this person is a lazy person. He doesn't do anything. And I'm killing myself working day and night. And then he comes and asks me for money. Do I have to give anything to him? Am I responsible to give to him? Or he comes and he asks me for something else. He asks for guidance. I'm telling him what to do, he's not doing it. Am I still responsible? Am I still tasked? Again, the answer to this question, the yes or no completely defines the interaction that the Muslims would have with one another. I think most people would say no, we're not responsible. And so you can see a person comes oblivious, doesn't care. Number 6, وَالْحَقُّ الصَّادِسِ أَنْ يَكُونَ لَكَ خَادِمٌ وَلَيْسَ لِأَخِيكَ خَادِمٌ فَوَاجِبٌ أَنْ تَبْعَثَ خَادِمَكَ فَيَغْسِلْ ثِيَابَهُ وَيَصْنَعْ طَعَامَهُ وَيَمْهَدْ فِرَاشَهُ. Okay, this is something that probably doesn't apply right now. If you have a worker, if you have a slave working in your house and your brother doesn't have one, send your slave to their house as well to work for them, to wash their clothes, to cook food for them. And number 7, وَالْحَقُّ الصَّابِئ أن تبر قسمه وتجيب دعوته وتعود مريضه وتشهد جنازته. Number 7 is that you make good his apportionment, you answer his invitation, and console his sick ones and attend his funeral. وإذا علمت أن له حاجة تبادره إلى قضائها ولا تلجئه أن يسلكها ولكن تبادره مبادرة. If you know that he has a need and he's probably going to come and ask you, don't wait for him to come and ask you. You hasten towards him and find out what his problem is and offer to resolve his problem. Don't resolve his problem for him without him even asking. That's how close the relationship needs to be. That means you can see, because you're already aynuhu, you're already his eyes, you're seeing what his problem is. You're so involved and informed with his life, you know what his problem is. It doesn't even need for him to come and tell you. You go and you quickly address the need. Or the community as a whole goes and addresses the need without making mention of who's doing what. That should be the state of the Muslim community. فَإِذَا فَعَلْتَ ذَلِكَ وَصَلْتَ وَلَايَتَكَ بِوَلَايَتِهِ. If you do this, your wilaya will be connected with his wilaya. وَوِلَايَتَهُ بِوَلَايَتِكَ. And his wilaya will be connected to your wilaya. Essentially, the both of you will enter this caravan together. Now you're travel mates, now you're travel buddies in this journey towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And both of you will be under the walaya of Allah. Without that, each of you are traveling separately. So to have the victory that was achieved in the caravan of Imam Hussain alayhi salatu wasalam, it's important for everyone to be traveling together and everyone to be traveling based on these rules. So that's number 1, the huquq. That means the rights that one believer has to another. We'll conclude with the next 2 points that are being made, and we'll inshallah come to a final conclusion. Number 2 is that in hadith we find, like I said, in Nahj al-Balagh and other places as well, from Amir al-Mu'mineen, and it's also been narrated from Hassan alayhi salatu wasalam, that they describe the characteristics of a brother that they had. Now this is in Nahj al-Balagh, you can find it, and it starts like this. كَانَ لِي فِي مَا مَضَى أَخٌ فِي اللَّهِ. I previously had a brother that was like this, a brother in faith that had these characteristics, and there are 12 of them. Number 1, وَكَانَ يُعْذِمُهُ فِي عَيْنِي. In my eyes, he was of great stature, and I respected him, I venerated him. صِغَرُ الدُّنْيَا فِي عَيْنِهِ وَكَانَ خَارِجًا مِنْ سُلْطَانِ بَتْهِ. Number 1 was that he saw the world as something that was very lowly, small. It wasn't really a big deal to him. Number 2, he was outside of the control of his stomach. His stomach, or his desires of the stomach, did not have control over him. Even his small small things that we think are not big deals. We struggle with them. I struggle with them. Stomach to have control over you is like this. Like sometimes I'll ask my wife to make me a sandwich, okay? In my mind, there are certain, condiments, there are certain, toppings that have to go in every sandwich that's being made. So if I'm having a hamburger, for example, there needs to be pickles in them, there needs to be onions in them, there has to be ketchup, that's what, okay. So if my wife makes me a sandwich, like she does, and she forgets to put one of the condiments in them, like she doesn't put any pickles in them, I lose my mind. Why? Because the sandwich is incomplete now. Because a hamburger cannot be a hamburger without the pickles on them. So if I get upset with my wife because she forgets to put pickles in them, it's because I care too much about what my stomach is telling me and less about what the feelings and the emotions of my wife is going to be. The Imam said, I had a friend, he wasn't like this. And his food was not something that was really going to upset him, even if it was a mistake on the part of someone else. Imagine you go to a Muslim restaurant, and this happens more than we care for it to happen. You make an order, whoever takes your order, whoever prepares your order, messes your order up. And it's overpriced for some reason. Now you get upset. We came to a Muslim establishment and they can't even get the order right. And you make a scene, and you throw a fit. You're saying, okay, I paid money for it. It's his right to prepare the food the way that I ordered it. Yes, but the Imam's also saying, is he your brother in faith? It's also your right not to lose your mind over your dinner order. He forgot, you forgive. It's okay, nothing, what will happen? It's one meal, correct? If it happens every time, you can put an anonymous message, brother, I love the food, sister, I love the food. For whatever reason, you forget to put this in my food. Please kindly remember next time to do it. Number 3. فَلَا يَشْتَهِي مَا لَا يَجِدْ وَلَا يُكْثِرُ إِذَا وَجَدْ. This is very important. He says that this person had such character that he didn't long for those things that he didn't have, and if he got something, he wouldn't ask for more. This is one of those characteristics that if we teach our children at a young age, we set them for life. If there's something you don't have, being patient about that. Other people have it, I don't have it. Okay, there's a reason for that. If you ask your father or mother for something and they don't give it to you, there's a reason. Number 1, either they think that thing is not good for you, so they're not going to give it to you. If you ask your parents, I want whatever, Nintendo DS, and your parent says no, the first thing in your mind is going to be like, my father, my mother doesn't love me. Why? Because my friends have Nintendo DS, I don't have it, so their parents love them more. Or I ask them, for example, for an iPhone 10, and they say no. Maybe my father, my mother right now doesn't have the financial capabilities to pay for it. It's okay. What's going to happen if all your friends have iPhone 10, you have iPhone 8? Nothing. But when you get something at the same time, be happy with what you have. Like, regardless if we want to compare with other people, what we have and what other people don't have, that should be enough for us to be satisfied with what we do have. But even looking to ourselves, how much is going to be enough? If a person has this characteristic that if they have one thing, they're happy with that one thing. If they have one pair of clothes, they're happy with that one pair. This is the character of our ulama. This is the character of our masumeen. If the clothes is okay, there's no reason to buy a second. I may say different, in different environments, I need to wear for work, I need something for play, that's fine. But if I have like 10 pairs of the same clothes for the same activity, it's excessive. It kills the heart. So be happy with what we have and be appreciative of what we have and communicate that appreciation. Whatever your parents have bought you, from time to time tell you thank you. Even the clothes that you're wearing right now. Thank you. I like this that you bought for me. It shows appreciation. Allah will give more to you. If you're unappreciative, Allah will not give you more. وَإِذْ تَأَذَّنَ رَبُّكُمْ لَإِنْ شَكَرْتُمْ لَأَزِيدَنَّكُمْ. Allah is saying, show me your appreciation, I'll give you more. The more you're thankful, the more I'll give you. If you're not appreciative, then of course I'm not going to give you any more. What's the point of giving something to someone who's not appreciative? So with the knowledge, like we were saying last night as well, that's another main point. However much knowledge and wisdom we receive, or however much of that we're able to keep, is dependent on how appreciative of that knowledge we are. If we're not appreciative of the knowledge will leave us, and at the same time we won't be put in a position to receive more knowledge. Next, the Imam says that وَكَانَ أَكْثَرَ دَهْرِهِ صَامِتًا. The majority of his life he was silent. He didn't speak. فَإِنْ قَالَ بَذَّ الْقَائِلِينَ وَنَقَعَ غَلِيلَ السَّائِلِينَ. But if he did open his mouth, he said something that was so profound that it silenced every other person that was speaking. And he would quench the thirst of the people who had questions. Again, this is the character of our ulama and our masumi. First, you have to ask them, because they're always going to be in a state of silence and even solitude. You have to go to them. Even when you go to them, sometimes you'll find they don't say anything. I remember in our early encounters with some of the ulama, I had a lot of questions, and I would go and sit with them, and I was waiting for them to kind of say something to start the conversation so I can ask all my questions. Sit there, wouldn't say anything. Of course, they would do salam and, exchange pleasantries. After that, silence, absolute silence. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. After a while, they would just ask, do you have a question? If you had a question, they would answer them quickly, they would leave. So, it's about being very precise with the words that you choose and when to speak and when not to speak. The Imam actually comes back to this. وَكَانَ ضَعِيفًا مُسْتَضْعَفًا فَإِنْ جَاءَ الْجِدُّ فَهُوَ لَيْثُ غَابٍ وَصِلُ وَادٍ لَا يُدْلِي بِحُجَّةٍ حَتَّى يَأْتَ قَاضِيًا. This is another very interesting one. He says, in appearance, he was extremely weak and feeble. Seemed like you could push him over. But when the time of fighting came, when the time of standing up for justice came, he was like a lion of the forest and a serpent of the valley. So, now you may say fighting, it may be physical fighting, okay. But even when it comes to standing up for what's right, some people that we look to them and say, this person can't do anything. He's so weak, he's so reserved. He's so, he doesn't seem to be strong. His character doesn't seem to be very strong. That's because he knows, his action is so calculated, he knows when to show his anger. He gets angry for Allah. He doesn't get angry for these small, trivial things. Again, the companions of the Imams were like this. I lose my temper very easily, so people see my anger all the time. But when it's time for me to be angry for the sake of Allah, I'm not like a lion anymore. Tail between the legs, I'm running away. I bring excuses, like we said last night. Number 6, when he put forth an argument, it was extremely decisive. He wouldn't speak unless his arguments were decisive. Number 7 is very interesting. وَكَانَ لَا يَلُومُ أَحَدًا عَلَى مَا يَجِدُ الْعُذْرَ فِي مِثْلِهِ حَتَّى يَسْمَعُ اعْتِذَارَهُ. Number 7, he says that he would not reproach any individual in an excusable matter unless he had heard their side of the story. I want to share 2 stories now about this characteristic of silence and sukut in the tradition of the ulama, specifically with the salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So 2 stories. One story is from one of our great contemporary almost scholars and mystics by the name of Ayatollah Qadi Tabatabai. This student of many great scholars and mystics that we have, namely of Allama Tabatabai, the writer of Al-Mizan. So, Ayatollah Qadi was very well known, not only for his studies, but also he was well known for his akhlaq, his irfan, his mysticism, his etiquette. One of the great scholars that was spending some time with him in Najaf in one of these schools by the name of Sayyid Muhammad Hussain Hamedani, he narrates that when I saw Ayatollah Qadi had come and taken, a dormitory in the school, because I knew of his character and who he was, I wanted to have a good relationship with him. So I went to him and I would spend a lot of time with him. In my interactions with him, I made a very, peculiar observation. And that was that when he spoke, I saw that in his mouth inside of it was bruised almost. It was odd to me. So I asked him, what's the story about why your mouth is bruised inside? And he didn't answer my question. I insisted, he didn't answer. Some time went by and I asked him again, and he still didn't answer. Finally, after an extended period of time where I was able to establish a close relationship with him, Ayatollah Qadi says that, I asked him, please, tell me what's the story with your mouth and this wound. And I don't have any other intention. I don't want to say this to spread this with the people. I'm so curious. I want to know. Teach me about what this is about. And Qadi said, okay. This wound that you see is the result of the process of purifying yourself in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is so difficult and so taxing and so challenging, and it requires so much commitment. Especially when it comes to being in control of your tongue and what you say and what you don't say. Not only saying something that is improper, a lie, doing backbiting, ghaibah, not even that, but to speak vain talk is something that is not characteristic of the believer, the mu'mineen. Quran speaks about this. He says that to stop myself and control myself before speaking so I don't say anything out of character, I would put a small pebble in my mouth. That I couldn't speak with the pebble in my mouth. So I was forced to take this pebble out of my mouth to speak. That itself acted as an impediment for me not to do that. It stopped me, a barrier. That because every time I wanted to speak, I had to take this out, that afforded me the opportunity to think about, is it worth what I'm going to say to take this out of my mouth? And he says in many cases it wasn't worth it. For 26 years, this practice continued. That there was a small pebble in the mouth of this great scholar. Every time he wanted to speak, he would take it out. Speak, put it back in. Now, the moral of the story here is not to put rocks in our mouths. So when we want to speak with people, every time we take it out, people think we're crazy. No. The point is that allow yourself some method, some strategy, that before you say something, you have an opportunity to think about, is it worth me saying this? And what will be the consequence of my speech? We have hadith from Amir al-Mu'minin alayhi salatu wasalam in Ghurra al-Hikam. He states, إِذَا تَكَلَّمْتَ بِكَلِمَةٍ مَلَكَتْكَ. If you speak a word, that word gains ownership over you. وَإِذَا سَكَتَّ عَنْهَا مَلَكْتَهَا. But if you stay silent and don't say that, you have ownership over that. Whatever you say, you cannot take that back. So the first thing a person should think about is that, is it worth saying? Now, a person like me says all sorts of things that are uncharacteristic of a believer. I definitely need to do something like this. Probably not the rock, but I need something. I need some mechanism that allows me to remind myself. Whatever works for any individual. We should find ways that works for us. Even for the younger generation. Perhaps it's more important for them. As parents, we teach them these things. This is story number one. Story number two was of another great scholar by the name of, they called him Sayyid al-Sukut, the silent Sayyid. And again, one of our contemporary scholars by the name of Sayyid Ayatollah Bahauddini, very recently passed away. He says that when I was a young boy, about 13 years old, in Qum there's a mountain by the name of Mountain of Prophet Khizr alayhi salam, right? They said that the Prophet had spent some time there and he prayed there. So they'd made a masjid on top of the mountain, and people will go there very frequently to not only do ziyarah but to pray there as well. There was a Sayyid that sat atop this mountain in the masjid, and he was silent all the time. It means for years after year after year. In some records say for 20 years this man had not spoken. And people knew he had special abilities. So even people who would come to do ziyarah and visit Qum would also go and visit this Sayyid as well. Because they had hawaj, they had problems, they had needs, they would go to the Sayyid so the Sayyid would help them with their needs. So Bahauddini says, when I was 13, me with my friends, we would go and see the Sayyid al-Sukut, this silent Sayyid, to see what he would do, what people would come, what they would ask of him. One day they said one person from a village came and said, for example, my daughter's sick. Please pray for her. And the Sayyid wouldn't speak. So he would just make a signal saying that your daughter has been cured. And they would go back and say the daughter has been cured. Or people would come and say, we have these needs. He would just point, make a signal, and that was taken care of. So the student of Bahauddini says that, I kept asking, pressing him, what was the secret of this person? What allowed this person to, be at the station where just by them making a dua, their dua was answered and they would signal and people would know. Because I want to do that as well. So I asked my teacher over and over and over. Finally, he answered my question also by signaling. He took his hand and pointed to his mouth. His tongue, you see his tongue? This person was in complete control of his tongue. Because he was in complete control and he said nothing that would hurt another believing man or another believing woman, he said nothing that was not becoming of a believing man or a believing woman, Allah gives him this capability. It's not difficult for Allah, it's not hard for Allah. Allah is not stingy, He gives to people to do these things. But a person has to be in control of himself before he does that. Imagine if you have this silent Sayyid here, Imagine you have a silent Sayyid here and people know that his du'as are answered, but at the same time he has bad akhlaq. What does that tell people? It tells people that you can get these high stations and do these great things, but it's not necessary for you to work on yourself. It's impossible for something like this to happen. He said that he closed his mouth, and by closing his mouth, he closed off the doors to the hellfire. So these are some of the practices that our ulama have had. Again, these may be too much for us right now. Every person to their own extent. Even for our young ones, we can teach them that. Because they're very excited to talk. Once they learn how to talk, they're very excited to talk. We shouldn't tell them not to speak, but we should teach them this principle as well. With speaking comes a responsibility. Before you say, think about what you're going to be said. If we practice this with them when they're younger, when they get older, it becomes a lot easier for them to do. And they become respected and honorable believing men and women. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Number 7, we said that the characteristic of this believing man, which was a good friend of the Imam, was that he would not reproach anyone before he heard their side of the story. Many of us, someone like me, is quick to judge people. We see, we hear, we observe, we assume. We assume. Without considering the context of what's happening. The context is as important, if not more important than the text that is presented. That means the backstory sometimes is more important than the action that's performed. Imagine, in the story of Prophet Musa ﷺ, there was an altercation, he defended, the person died. Right? He struck the man died. Now imagine if someone just wants to look at that without understanding the context. This guy's a murderer. Your prophets are murderers. These are the people you take as your moral guides. And things like this exist in the lives of all of the Imams and the prophets as well. So the context is really important to understand why people are doing things. When the Imam says that the characteristic of the believer is not to quickly come and blame, it's to ask them, even if what they do is so reprehensible, first thing you should do is to ask them, why did you do what you did? Maybe this was the reaction to a difficulty so severe that it's outside of the control of a person. When we are pushed to the extent of our abilities, we do crazy things. If we want to only observe people in their most vulnerable state and then try them based on that, we're being unfair to them. And many times we're not observant to the lower and the more subtle and tacit actions of people until it boils over to something grand. Okay, how many communities do we hear, and sometimes a lot of times it's not even communicated. How many times do we hear like a young man or a young woman, for whatever reason, takes their own life? This happens all the time in Muslim communities. Young people, 13, 14, 15 years old. Sometimes even these people, you say, okay, they were probably bullied at school. Yeah, in a case recently, there was a young girl that took her life. She was bullied, but not in a public school. She was bullied in a Muslim school. Okay. And everyone's confused. Why? Why would a person take their life? Their behavior many times may not show that they're really at a state that they're so out of their own control. They're so out of their own depth. They need help. They just don't know how to ask for it. If a believer is so close to one another, their ayn, their eyes, their guide, their advisor, if they're so connected and so in communication that they can observe a person's actions and they can see some of these dangerous signs, these red flags, before something like this happens, they can try and do something. But when a person is oblivious, it's hard. And then a person afterwards, kind of has to sit and say, well, what could we have done better? The first thing a person can do is to try and be more connected with one another. Don't just look to find the faults in other people. Hear their sides of the story. If we hear the stories of the people, we will be in a much more favorable position to do right by them and to try and make up for some of our shortcomings. In Karbala, that's what happened. The family of the Prophet was paraded in cities, in Kufa and Damascus. Okay? The people were celebrating the death of the shuhada And we're happy that these people have been taken captive. Why? Because these were rebels to the Muslim community in their minds. What did the Ahlul Bayt do? They said, sit down. Let us tell you our side of the story. This prophet that is your everything in your life, we are from his progeny. We are his family. We were raised under his supervision, under his wing. This is who we are. Immediately the people, their complete conception of what was happening flipped. And many of them showed a reaction that led to a lot of the uprisings that happened afterward because of that. Hearing the other side of the story without being quick to judge. Number 8. And I'll just read the English because I know we're running out of time. He would not speak of any ailment except after he had disappeared. He's in a time of difficulty. Now again, this may contradict the statement that we've said afterwards. If a believer is of strong moral character, he's not always complaining of his difficulties. Not saying that he doesn't communicate at all with anybody, no. But he's not quick to complain about his state. He's a little patient. Number 9, he would say what he would do and would not say what he would not do. Again, this is characteristic of our imams and our ulama as well. In the Quran we said, speaks of this like we mentioned last night. Number 10, 11, and 12, the final 3. وَكَانَ إِذَا غُلِبَ عَلَى الْكَلَامِ لَمْ يُغْلَبْ عَلَى السُّكُوتِ. If he was to be exceeded in speaking, he would never be defeated in his silence. No one would beat him in how silent they were. And if two things he was more eager to listen than to speak in number 12, which is so important. If two things confronted him and he had to make a choice, he would see which one was more akin to the longing of his heart. Which one he liked more. Which one pleased him more. And then he chose to do the opposite of the one that pleased him more. Again, this is speaking to Quranic instruction. The Quran in Surah An-Nazi'at says, وَأَمَّا مَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ وَنَهَى النَّفْسَ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ فَإِنَّ الْجَنَّةَ هِيَ الْمَأْوَىٰ. The person who fears the station of their Lord and abstains and forbids their desires, then for them is the result of the Jannah. Now, again, this is a very, very important, critical characteristic and behavioral characteristic that if we teach our children early on, we've really set them up for an easier life. An easier life when it comes to practicing Islamic principles. So what is the principle here? Some of the scholars would tell us that when they were being raised early on as kids, not in the seminaries or anything like that, their parents had this sort of quality that sometimes they would give them money to go buy snacks. Okay? So, your child sometimes says, I'm hungry, let's go get a snack. You say, okay, no problem. So you give them the money, here's $1, here's $2, here's $5. Go buy whatever you want. Okay? Go buy whatever you want. You can buy a candy bar, you can buy chips, you can buy soda, all of these are bad, but in any case, you're free to choose whatever you want. But when you're going to choose from all the things that you like, ask yourself, of the candy bar, of the bag of chips, of the soda, which of these do I like most? That means list them for yourself. This is my favorite, most favorite, number 1. This is the second one. The third one is not bad. I still like it, but I don't like it as much as these two. Once you ask yourself these 3 questions, then from time to time, say, today I'm going to say no to myself. Not that I'm not going to get any of these no. I'm going to say no to these first 2. And I'm going to pick my third choice. What happens now if a person practices from an early age to say no to themselves? But right now this is snacks. It's okay. They're allowed to have it. Now the next thing, the clothes. Which clothes do you like? I really, really, really want this one. This one's not bad either, but this is my favorite. Don't force, the parent should not force the child, but encourage them. Which one is your second choice? And teach them from time to time to choose their second choices. Why? Because tomorrow when they become older and their hawa, their shahwa is so strong and overpowering, that training will kind of kick in. And when they have a choice to make, not between 2 things that are good and permissible and okay, between one thing that is good and one thing that is bad. One thing that is productive, healthy, one that is destructive. It's sin. There the training kicks in and the person can stop himself from something that is so pleasing to them. Very few children, very few preteens, teens, do we observe that have this kind of an upbringing? So the parent wants them to make the choice then. At 14, 15, the parent's trying to teach them, you're going to have choices to make, hard choices. Make sure when you're afforded that choice, make the right one. Right? Because you can't be with your child all the time. You have to teach the child to be responsible in your absence. Right? When your child goes to high school, you can't be there every time your child is afforded something that's dangerous to them. The first time your child is afforded drugs, you're not going to be there to see, whether they're going to accept it or not. All of the training that you've done prior to that moment, that's where it's really going to show itself. If you've taught your child to say no, to things, two things that are good. Here, when something is not good, when it's bad, the person, it's easier for them to make that. With all the pressure that comes, the peer pressure, the school pressure, all of that, it makes it a lot easier for them to make that decision. In the Holy Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in Surah Al-Imran, verse 92, لَن تَنَالُوا الْبِرَّ حَتَّى تُنْفِقُوا مِمَّا تُحِبُّونَ. None of you will achieve righteousness, goodness, until you give from those things that you like most. Now here, the context of the verse is more about finances. Until you don't give from the possessions that you have, you'll never reach the higher stages. But also from the pleasures that a person has. Until they're not able to give from them, sacrifice from them, the person will never arrive at that station of consciousness and righteousness. Finally, the Imam concludes, فَعَلَيْكُمْ بِهَذِهِ الْخَلَائِقِ. It is incumbent upon you to have these qualities. فَالْزَمُوهَا وَتَنَافَسُوا فِيهَا. Acquire them and excel in them. And finally, the last statement, we'll end with this. The Imam says that even if you can't have all of these 12, at least know that having some of them is better than not having any of them. Don't have an all or nothing sort of attitude. Either I'm going to have all of them and be very good, or I'm not going to have any of them and be very bad. No. Work with them one at a time. If one is difficult for you, go to the one that's easy. If you're already kind of introverted and being quiet is easy for you, that's fine. Start with that. But know the reason why you're doing that. And then work on and move on from them one by one to try and establish. So here, this was a prescription, more importantly for the parents. These are things that we should try and work on with our children, to teach them not only what to do, but why they should be doing it. And at an early age. Don't underestimate the potential of your children. Never say they're too young. Always say it's getting late. They're getting too old. They're not young enough. Think about that, because those hard choices will come earlier than we think. Because we think of the world as being a safer place, when in reality it's an extremely dangerous place, specifically in the time and the space that we're living in. I know we're out of time right now, so I'll just kind of end with mentioning the hadith that can be found. It's advice that one imam gives to another. And I'll just mention them real quickly. There are 5 types of people that Imam Zainul Abidin alayhi salatu wasalam instructs his son Imam al-Baqir not to have. These 5 types of people. I know in a lot of the younger people's mind is like, okay, you're talking about we should be friends with Muslim people, okay. We should have these characteristics, but what about other people as well? Should we completely disassociate with them? No. But at the very least, be cautious of these 5 types of people and don't associate with them. The Imam said, don't associate yourself with 5 types of people. Imam Baqir alayhi salatu wasalam asked, and who are they? The Imam says, number 1, don't associate with a person who is a fasiq. Fasiq is a person who has low moral character. A person who has low moral character is ill-mannered. Don't associate and don't befriend them. Why? Because if you befriend that person, they will sell your friendship for what he calls luqma, for a bite of food, or even less than that. Imam Baqir says that what is less than a bite of food? He says that he will sell you not for a bite of food that he actually eats, but for something that he longs for. That means he craves it, but even he doesn't get that. He will sell your friendship even to that. Number 2, don't befriend a person who is a stingy, someone who is bakhil. Why? Because when you're in dire need of help, that person will refuse you. He won't help you. Number 3, don't associate with a person who is a liar. Because if you associate and befriend a person who is a liar, then that person will be like a mirage. Meaning what? He will make those things which are truly far for you, difficult for you to acquire, he'll make it seem easy. And those things that are so near to you, he will make them seem far. Sometimes the bad friend does that. Those things that are so far, meaning what? Meaning an ill character that is so unbecoming of a person, a bad friend will make that so easy and accessible. For parents, sometimes it's inconceivable how our child why and how our children do certain things. One of those reasons is because they associate with bad friends. That bad friend will set up the grounds for your child to so easily and effortlessly do things that you, in your wildest dreams, thought were not possible. Those are very difficult moments for parents. That first time when you hear or observe your child do something that is so uncharacteristic of them. How could you have done that? Again, remember, like we said in the earlier hadith, don't quickly accuse. Ask them why. What led you to do something like that? And more times than not, you'll find the environment has a great effect on why people do things do the things that they do, and specifically children. Number 4, don't associate with a person who is ignorant. The hadith says ahmaq, person who is not smart, ignorant. Why not? Because a person like that, they intend to help you, but they end up hurting you instead. They want to do good for you because they don't know better, they end up hurting you. And number 5, don't associate with a person who has bad relationships with their family, who are divorced from their family. If you have friends in school or friends in any other place, teammates, whatever, and you find that they're disrespectful to their parents, we see that a lot of times in other cultures. Younger kid yells at the mother, yells at the father, speaks very rude to them. Imam says, be careful, be wary of that person, don't befriend them. Stay away from them. The hadith actually begins, it says, don't even share a conversation with a person like that when you're walking on the street. To that level, don't have anything to do with these kind of people because they have a very destructive effect on your heart. So to summarize and to conclude, inshallah, from the talk that we presented tonight in the 3 nights, if we want to continue working towards the values that were not presented, but were, the Muslim community was reminded of them in the movement and the reform of Imam Hussein alayhi salatu wasalam. If we want to relive those, revive those, there needs to be established within the Muslim community a brotherhood and a bond so strong, as strong that was observed in the caravan of the Imam. This is not an easy thing to do, but we have to begin with them somehow. You say, well, that's a grand task. Just like the Imam said, take things one step at a time. Let us have an assessment and a review of really what is the state of our personal interactions with other brothers and sisters of faith. What is stopping us from engaging with them and for our relationships to have these sort of parameters? What's stopping us from doing that? And number 2 is that, what can we do together to alleviate some of the problems that we have? Remember, we're all preparing ourselves. We are preparing the grounds for the return of the Holy Imam of our time. This has to happen before the Imam comes and takes leadership over that. Like we said last night, many times people came to the Imam and says, we're ready, come. The Imam says, ask some questions about these sorts of things. How do you associate with one another? How are your relationships with one another? Is it like this? They would say, no. The Imam says, you're not ready yet. So as a community, this is where we need to focus our attention. And by educating ourselves and doing justice to our education, we can hopefully, to establish reform within ourselves and within the community, inshallah. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. With the 1 or 2 minutes that we have, a final musibah recited tonight, inshallah, as we remember the masa'ib, the difficulties and the challenges of the Ahlul Bayt in this tragedy in Karbala and also before and after that. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah al-aliyyil azim. Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah. Assalamu alayka ya ibn Rasulillah. السلام عليك يا ابن أمير المؤمنين وابن سيد الوسيل. O our Imam Aba Abdullah, for many of us tonight marks a farewell from this month of Muharram and Safar. For many of us it will be the next year before we come back, Ya Hussein, to hear your story and to cry over your martyrdom and the difficulties and strife of your family and Ahlul Bayt. Ya Mawlaya, Ya Aba Abdullah. We remember on a night like this that we bid our farewells to the majalis. Some of the lines of poetry that Sukaina recited when she was bidding farewell to your body as they were being taken captive to Kufa and then Damascus. Ya Hussein, just like the Ahlul Bayt after, they were not afforded enough time to spend with your body and the body of the martyrs. Ya Hussein, I know that 40 days have passed, but for me these 40 days is not enough to quench the thirst of the love that I have for you, Ya Aba Abdullah. I wish that every day and night of my life could be spent in the majalis of the remembrance of you, Ya Mawlai. They say that Sakina, when she was leaving the body of Imam al-Hussein, before she left, she throws her body on the body that has no head lying on Karbala. They say that she had a vision and she sees Abu Abdullah instructing her and the Shi'as of how to conduct themselves when they remember him after that. شيعتي ما إن شربتم ري عذب فاذكروني شيعتي ما إن شربتم ري عذب فاذكروني أو سمعتم بغريب أو شهيد فاندبوني. Oh my Shia, oh my followers, whenever you drink some water, do not forget to remember me, O Shia. Whenever you hear about a stranger or a martyr, do remember to lament and engage in my mourning. وأنا السبت الذي من غير جرم قتلوني وبجرد الخيل بعد القتل عمدا سحقوني. I am the grandchild of a prophet who was killed without sin, and after my martyrdom they intentionally trampled my body with the horses. ليتكم في يوم عاشوراء جميعا تنظروني. Oh my Shia, how I wish you were all present on the day of Ashura and witness كيف أستسقي لطفلي فأبوا أن يرحموني. How I requested water for my newborn son, and how these enemies failed to have mercy on him. وسقوه سهما بغي عوض الماء المعين. Oh my Shia, I wish you were there to witness that instead of water that was requested, they quenched the thirst of my newborn with an arrow in his throat. يا لرزق ومصاب هد أركان الجحود. Oh, what a great tragedy that the grand mountains shook and were destroyed. ويلهم قد جرحوا قلب رسول الثقلين فلعنوهم ما استطعتم شيعتي في كل حين. Woe unto you, those who injured the heart of the Prophet of Thaqalain. Oh my Shi'as, send curses on them as much as you can at every moment. Ya Abu Abdullah, these were your instructions to Lady Sakina as she visits your body laying bare on the lands of Karbala. Ya Abu Abdullah, when I remember your sorrow, when I remember your thirst, when I remember your trampled body, Ya Abu Abdullah, I also think, when is the time going to come? When is the time going to come that I can avenge your martyrdom? Ya Mawlai, when will the time come that my Imam will return and I can take revenge over the blood that was spilled in Karbala? Ya Abu Abdullah, I ask you to also allow me to have a vision, and in that vision I know of the whereabouts of my Imam.
I read in Dua Nudba on Fridays, ليت شعري أين استقرت بك النوى. Oh my Imam, if I only knew the destination of your journey. بل أي أرض تقلك أو ثرى أبي رضوى أو غيرها أمضيتها. Oh, the Imam of my time, if I knew which isolated land you went to. Oh Imam, if I knew good, pleasant and satisfying where you are or otherwise. Oh Imam, are you in a well-guarded area or are you not safe? عزيز علي أن أرى الخلق ولا ترى. Oh my Imam, it breaks my heart when I look around at all of the creation but I do not see you. ولا أسمع لك حسيسا ولا نجوى. Nor do I hear any whisper about your whereabouts nor any secret communications. عزيز علي أن تحيط بك دنيا البلوى. Oh my Imam, it breaks my heart that I know that you are attending and watching over us, over the disorder and the confusion of our time. ولا ينالك مني ضجيج ولا شكوى. I am in the thick of this violent turmoil, O Imam. I am far away from you, unable to give report of any injustice. O my Imam, بنفسي أنت من مغيب لم يخل منا. O my Imam, I eagerly long for your return, for who is out of sight. But O Imam, I know that you have not forsaken us. بنفسي أنت من نازح ما نزح عنا. I eagerly long for your return, who is departed, and you are now invisible to me. But I know at the same time you are not far away from me. بنفسي أنت أمنية شائق يتمنى. I eagerly long for your return, who inspires love and deep affection. من مؤمن ومؤمنة ذكرا فحنا. Among the faithful men and women who take delight in your memorable glory. بنفسي أنت من عقيد عز لا يسامى. O my Imam, I eagerly long for you who is worthy of acceptance and lawful driving force of belief and conviction. O Imam, I eagerly long your return. Ya Aba Abdullah, we ask you, as we remember you, we remember your Ahlul Bayt. We ask by the right of your martyred body, a body that is now rolling in its own blood, a body that the head has been severed. We ask by the Ahlul Bayt being taken prisoner. We ask by the chained hands of Zainul Abidin. We ask by the grave of Zainab. Ya Aba Abdullah, grant us on a night like this the opportunity to reconnect with our Imam, Sahib al-Asri wal-Zaman. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم إنا نسألك وندعوك باسمك العظيم العظيم العز الجل الأكرم إلهي بحق الفاطمة وبحق الحسين. يا الله 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 يا رحمن يا رحيم يا مقلب القلوب ثبت قلوبنا على دينك. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج. اللهم عجل لوليك الفرج والعافية والنصر واجعلنا من خير أنصاره وأعوانه والمستشهدين بين يديه. Ya Allah, we ask you by the right of this night to hasten the reappearance of our holy Imam. Ya Allah, we ask you by the right of this night to guide us, to guide our children, to protect us and to protect our children on the right path. Ya Allah, we ask you by the right of this night to bring a speedy recovery and good health to all of those who are ill. Ya Allah, we ask you to forgive and grant the highest station to all of our marhumin, all of those who have passed away from our loved ones. Ya Allah, we ask you by the right of this night to give good health and victory to all of the Muslims, all of the mu'mineen across the world who are being oppressed, our Muslim brothers and sisters, whether from the Shia or whether from the other Muslim denominations. Ya Allah, bring them a quick recovery. Ya Allah, we ask you to give good health and a long life to all of our scholars, all of those who serve this religion. Ya Allah, we ask you to bless all of those who sponsor the majalis, especially the majalis of tonight, and inshallah to protect this institution and for it to continue to be an institution of the remembrance of Hussein and his Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam bin Nabi wa alih. Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
Say,
Hussein.
Hussein, 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 Hussein.